Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 11th of January 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, is Mike Robinson. Where's the month going, Mike?
It's going very quickly, and it's turning green, apparently.
It's turning green, so the good news is green.
It is. The good news is green. A greener future is on its way. This is the 25-year environmental plan that the Prime Minister, Theresa May, has set out. And apparently it is the government's determination to leave our environment in a better state than we found it. She's been outlining steps for a cleaner, greener Britain with avoidable plastic waste eliminated by the end of 2042. So let's see what she had to say. She said, "We look back in horror at some of the damage done to our environment in the past and wonder how anyone could have thought that, for example, dumping toxic chemicals untreated into rivers was ever the right thing to do. In years to come, I think people will be shocked at how today we allow so much plastic to be produced needlessly. In the UK alone, the amount of single-use plastic wasted every year would fill 1,000 Royal Albert Halls."
Wow.
Yes, that's what I thought too. I want the Britain of the future, she said, to be a truly global Britain, which is a force for good in the world. Well, that would be the first time in history, I think. Steadfast in upholding our values. Whose values? Her values? My values? I'm not sure which. Not least our fierce commitment to protecting the natural environment. When we host the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in April, we will put the sustainable development of our oceans firmly on the agenda. We will work with our partners to create a Commonwealth Blue Charter and push for strong action to reduce plastic waste in the ocean. We will direct our development spending to help developing nations reduce plastic waste, increase our own marine protection areas at home, and establish a new blue belt protection areas in our overseas territories. So what we're saying here is nothing to do with Theresa May. And doesn't she look delightful today?
It's only got little beads on today.
Only little beads on today. But this is nothing to do with Theresa May doing anything for the environment at all. It's all about pushing British soft power out to the world, global Britain, Commonwealth, and how we can deal with people in Africa and so on with foreign aid budgets. Well, what else is part of this 25-year environment plan? Well, it's this, as CityLab here, a bit ironic that CityLab is promoting this, but anyway, the CityLab here is saying Britain's next mega project, a coast-to-coast forest. And this is a plan for 50 million new trees to repopulate one of the least wooded areas of the country in the north. This is the Northern Powerhouse at work here, Brian, and offer a natural landscape from several cities in the north. They say that the UK government unveiled plans for a vast new forest spanning the country from coast to coast, shadowing the path of the east-west M62 highway. This new forest will create a broad green rib across England from Liverpool to the east coast city of Hull. If fully realised along the lines announced this week, the forest will ultimately contain 50 million new trees, stretched in a dense 62,000 acre patchwork along the 120-mile strip. This sounds wonderful. But first, a reality check. If Britain is planning new forests, they say, it's because the island badly needs them. Overall, the UK's landscape contains one of Europe's lowest proportions of woodland, just 13%. So I was wondering, what's this about? And the map, struck me as being something that I'd kind of seen before. Couldn't think where. And of course, I'm being slightly sarcastic because, of course, every time Ian R. Crane is in the studio to produce a fracking nightmare program, he produces this map, which is basically exactly the same territory in the north of England, which is all the licensed fracking areas in the country. So if we overlay them, I mean, they're not an exact match, I grant you, but nonetheless, that is basically what we're looking at. So the question is, what are we looking at? Is this a case of them wanting to pay farmers, to the farmers that are probably going to have fracking licensed land where fracking has been licensed, pay farmers to convert that farmland over from being farmland to something else? Because
you'd no longer be able to grow food crops, quality food crops on the land after the fracking has taken place.
Well, exactly. And of course you've got the noise and the unsightliness of frack pads. They want to hide those in amongst the trees perhaps. And so there's several reasons why you might want to plant a forest there. I mean, why aren't they planting the forest, for example, in the Midlands or in Wales or in East Anglia? They've chosen this particular area, which is the most licensed fracking zone in the country. I find that a bit coincidental.
The thing this reminds me of is some years ago there were plans to put in one of these mega forests somewhere south of Bristol or southeast of Bristol, I think it was, and there was a great deal in the media about it. This was an absolutely wonderful thing, and then suddenly silence and nothing further was heard about it. So is this real, or is this something to do with helping the fracking industry? Or is it part of the real rewilding of UK programme, which is part of the UN sustainability agenda?
I think it's all of the above. But if we look at the map again, I mean, a large proportion of this land, which is going to be given back over to forest, of course, is farmland. And I just want to remind everybody of this report from Farmers Weekly just over a year ago. Or sorry, I think this is 2016. So that's 2 years ago. 50% of the UK's food and feed is sourced from overseas. So, Brian, if you're currently only producing 50% of what you need to feed your population in the UK on UK farms, it is a sensible policy decision to hand farmland back to the wild.
Well, of course it's not, but the other thing we're doing is chewing up increasing acreage of farmland with solar panels, which you can usually see as you drive your car along the motorway. So food production from the nation not seen as a problem. Maybe the ultimate intention is for a reduction of UK's population.
I think we've said that already this year, and so if you look back over the last couple of UK columns, you might have heard similar comments in other contexts. Okay, so let's have a look at Theresa May once again, and of course what she said was, I want Britain of the future to be a truly global Britain, and as we mentioned already, a lot of this business over the environment policy is to do with foreign aid. So let's look at the newly appointed Harriet Baldwin, who has moved from Defence Procurement to become Minister for Africa in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the Department for International Development. And she said, I'm honoured to have been appointed and look forward to representing global Britain with African nations to tackle a range of opportunities and challenges in Africa. The UK has a long-standing and important relationship in Africa, and I will work for an even stronger partnership with African nations, finding new ways to fight poverty, minimise threats and build mutual prosperity. 18 African countries are part of the Commonwealth, so a priority for the upcoming Commonwealth Summit will be looking at how we meet the ambitions of the next generation, including creating new jobs and economic growth. So crucial for modern Africa.
So we can't deal with the UK at the moment. We cannot run this country in a satisfactory way, whether it's the roads or the schools or its industry. But here we are sending these arrogant MPs to deal with the situation in Africa.
Yes,
the arrogance of it is just mind-boggling.
Yes, but the key theme here is, of course, hashtag Global Britain and the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting is taking place in April, and clearly Theresa May is ramping up for that. And as we've said many times, the Commonwealth is to be used to promote the globalist agenda. And I think that's what we're seeing with this forest in the north of England, this Agenda 21, Agenda 2030 policy at work.
Yep.
And we clearly intend to try to export that to Commonwealth countries at the very least.
Whether they want it or not.
Indeed. Okay, Brexit then. And well, Nigel Farage was on the television this morning. And he said, as he was on Channel 5, he said that perhaps we should have a second referendum on the European Union, Brian. Because that will kill the issue off once and for all, apparently. He said that the percentage of people who would vote to leave the next time would be very much bigger than the last time, and that would put the likes of Tony Blair back in his box, apparently. But it's all a bit strange, because why would he want a second referendum?
Well, I believe that this man, and I've said so over a great many years, is extremely dangerous. If you watch what he has done, he waves a flag, he gets principally the UKIP voters excited, he leads them in a certain direction, and then he abandons them in the middle of no man's land. So what is he proposing now? Well, what will a second referendum do? It will give the Remain campaign time to regroup and get their ducks in a row. It will create huge confusion. It will help divide the nation. I don't think this man has ever wanted Britain out. I think his job has been to act as a safety valve for people who got too close to the truth in wanting to get Britain out of the European Union. So he's just handed power in the party over to Henry Bolton, who's been splattered all over the mainstream papers as a result of his private life. So that's another Farage-created agenda. And to have a second referendum on the back of UKIP is just incredible. Why isn't he asking the questions about why Theresa May is not taking Britain out of the European Union? Why is he not showing what the Conservative Party is really doing at the moment?
Well, let's just have a look at what the Conservative Party is really doing at the moment, because this is an article about a joint article that Philip Hammond and David Davis wrote yesterday for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. And they say that yesterday, well, they say today, but that was yesterday, we're both in Germany to highlight the important relationship that exists between our countries. It is a relationship built on shared interests and shared values that has helped both our nations prosper and grow. And while the UK will leave the EU next year, we can still look to the future with a shared vision, one that sees Germany, Britain and the EU continue to thrive, and our relationship remains strong and close. They said that trade between the UK and EU 27 is worth 750 billion euros a year, and a quarter of EU exports to Britain worth 113 billion euros a year will come from Germany, more than any other EU country. Of course, we understand, they say, that Germany and other EU countries want to protect the integrity of the single market, and that without all the obligations of EU membership, third countries cannot have all the benefits. Those priorities are not inconsistent with ours, a deep and special relationship with our closest trading partners and allies. And they went on to say that our commitment to Europe's security is unwavering, and we'll seek to agree new arrangements that will allow us to keep the close UK-EU cooperation to tackle the shared threats we face. Meanwhile, there's important choices to be made about how we find the right balance in Britain's new relationship with the EU. They go on to talk about trade, and they say that when we leave the European Union, we will leave the customs union and the single market, but in agreeing a new model of cooperation, we should not restrict ourselves to models and deals that already exist. They talk a little bit about financial services and about how we must redouble our efforts to make sure Brexit doesn't put financial system at risk. And they say that for such a close trade relationship in goods and services to succeed, we will need to maintain our common principles, including our shared belief in high standards, and continue the intelligent cooperation of our regulators, because the trust we place in each other's regulators in a whole range of areas has been built up over many years of cooperation, and there's no good reason why it should disappear after the UK leaves the EU. So we've got to stay in, Brian. They talk about the transition period. They say that during this transition period that they proposed that each other's markets will continue in their current form using the EU's existing rules, regulations and agencies. And they say Brexit will inevitably mean a shift away from, a shift in the way the UK and the European companies do business together. But with the next set of negotiations just around the corner, a bold, positive and exciting new chapter of our history together awaits. So I don't hear any language about separation there at all. They're talking about staying within the regulatory bodies. And if we are within those regulatory bodies, we've got to conform to the regulatory rules. And so we're not out.
And life continues. Half in, half out, actually nothing's changed. Very interesting that we're on the subject of Brexit. So the chat in our chat room getting quite interesting. One person said, no, Brian, a fair vote and we'd wipe the floor with Blair and co. To which I say, what makes you think you're going to get a fair vote with anything to do with the European Union? And of course, we've seen time and time again that the government is determined not to give a fair vote in any sense. So I'm going to stick with my point. What Farage is proposing is immensely dangerous. We can say he's incompetent on one hand, but I actually think he knows perfectly well what he's doing, encouraging a second referendum so that the whole thing can be dragged into a morass and more delay in which we're locked in. Well, of course, the BBC would probably love to have a second referendum. I've picked up today on BBC and BBC's duplicity. And what triggered this section in today's news was this video on two little girls in Syria who were very badly burnt as a result of a shelling incident. Now, this has been put together in a video, which I'm going to say is very sensitive. It's showing the injuries these two little girls sustained, and it's also showed how brave they've been at getting themselves back into school and back into some sort of social life, and having to deal with those injuries and the disfigurement. But at the same time, this is the same BBC that, of course, was desperate to get the violence started in Syria, was desperate to get British bombs falling in Syria, desperate to support the British government who was working to start the violence and to basically regime change Assad. And of course, the BBC's own charity, BBC Media Action, boasted publicly that it helped foment the unrest in Syria itself. So I was just fascinated at how a BBC journalist and the filmmakers could produce this little clip without going that step further and saying, well, actually, how did all of this violence start? Because, of course, these two girls are two amongst probably hundreds of thousands of children that have been injured or traumatized by the war. So let's just remind ourselves of how the BBC works. This is going back to, I think this is May last year, to 2016, is it?
2017.
2017, I beg your pardon. So Syria government producing chemical weapons at research facilities. So there's the headline. It is very clear. It's very bold. The Syrian government is producing chemical weapons at research facilities. However, this is not true, and it's very easy to show from the BBC's own article why it's not true. But nevertheless, the start for the reader is that the headline is presented as fact. The headline is in fact a lie. So let's have a look at some of the things that are being said here. And this is the start of it. The Syrian government is continuing to make chemical weapons in violation of a 2013 deal to eliminate them. A Western intelligence agency has told the BBC. Document says chemical and biological munitions are produced at 3 main sites near Damascus and Hama. And then there are the key words, it alleges.
Yes.
It alleges. So let's carry on and see how this propaganda continues. The intelligence document obtained by the BBC says Syria's chemical weapons are manufactured at 3 sites. And these are all branches of the Scientific Studies and Research Centre, a government agency, it adds. Well, we'll do one more, which is this one. It says the Masyaf and Bazeh, if I pronounce that properly, facilities both specialise in installing chemical weapons on long-range missiles and artillery. Okay, so we've got the alleged in there, and let's bring in this one here, which is well down in the article. The intelligence information about the suspected weapons manufacturing sites was shared with the BBC on condition that the agency providing it would not be named. So this is an anonymous agency. And the BBC then says again, it does not give detail about how the, quote, alleged evidence was gathered. We have an anonymous organisation producing no evidence whatsoever. This is simply an allegation, and yet the headline the BBC uses is to say that the Syrian government is using chemical weapons. So let's follow on. What else have we noticed the BBC doing? Well, this is one we picked up on back in 2016. The BBC was helping to stir up unrest in Iran, by pointing out that some women did not want to wear the headscarf, the hijab, and the BBC was clearly encouraging Iranian women to stand up against religious doctrine and indeed religious police who might want them to wear this headgear. And we've contrasted this with a role model of a typical woman that the BBC thinks that presumably Iranian society should adopt. We did email the BBC direct and we asked them why they were doing this. I'll have to say we did get a response from the BBC eventually, but the response was simply a fob off that they thought they'd been perfectly fair in producing the article. We don't think so, and we'll remind viewers of this one that we did show some months ago. Here's the headline: "What do New Yorkers think about this photo?" And essentially the BBC's mocking a Muslim woman in her particular dress by putting her next to a transvestite on the subway. And what's the subliminal message, Mike? The subliminal message here is that the woman in the burqa is essentially part of a backward society where women are not treated properly. But if you're a transvestite in Western society, then with your mobile phone, that's really the way you should be. So let's come back to those little girls. I will be fair to the journalist who produced this article. She simply says that a shell resulted in fire which burnt the two girls. She doesn't say who fired the shell, so the article is neutral from that point of view. But I'm going to say, why can't this lady, Caroline Hawley, understand what her paymaster, the BBC, is really doing when it's been complicit in helping to create the suffering in Syria? What I'm really saying is I feel very passionate about that film of those two little girls. Isn't it time that the BBC started to ask the key question of who is really creating these wars?
Well, our illustrious Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, is in Brussels today for what are being described as high-level meetings focused on the Iran nuclear deal. He's at the table there with the Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, the French Foreign Minister, the German Foreign Minister, and of course, well, you can't see her in the photograph, but the EU Foreign Minister in waiting, High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Federica Mogherini, is there as well. Now, what did Boris have to say about these meetings? He said the UK has always been clear the Iran nuclear deal is a crucial agreement that makes the world safer. It's vital that we continue to work with our European partners to preserve the Iran deal and with it the security and prosperity it's bringing to the people of Iran and the world. It is these shared interests which will drive our discussions in Brussels. And he said, of course, there are areas where we disagree with Iran, not least on its destabilizing regional activity and its ballistic missile program. This will be an important part of our conversation. I will be making it clear to Foreign Minister Zarif on the subject of recent protests in Iran that the right to peaceful demonstration within the law is central to any truly thriving society. I will also raise all our Iranian dual national consular cases. So again, he's going to discuss the case of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who is, of course, the British Iranian woman who's been imprisoned for 21 months now on spying charges, which she denies. She was working, if you remember, for Thomson Reuters Foundation, and previously for that, working for BBC Media Action, which of course is the organisation that Brian's just been mentioning, that has been so keen to foment regime change in foreign countries.
Yeah. So is she innocent? Has she been caught in yet another backlash as a result of the BBC? Needs to be some more investigation into this. But I have to laugh. Boris Johnson talking about rights and peaceful demonstration. We're now at the stage in UK where street preachers are arrested for preaching on the streets. We understand that there's been a young man has gone through a pretty appalling court case as a result of supposedly making hate speech comments. We've got Melanie Shaw, child abuse whistleblower, now into her 19th month, most of which has been spent in solitary confinement with no proper medical treatment. And Boris Johnson is overseas lecturing the Iranian people on how they should run their country.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal. Well, we're going to say thank you to the people who responded to our request yesterday that if anybody in London today was able to support Sabine McNeill in her court case, we felt this is something well worth supporting, and quite a few of you have responded. So I hope that some will be able to attend. As I said, Sabine has been speaking out for some time about that terrible child abuse case, ritualistic abuse case in Hampstead. And as a result of trying to stand up for the mother and children in particular, she's now facing quite serious charges, which could, I understand, see her imprisoned. So welcome to the Conservative Theresa May's Britain. If you stand up to protect children, you're likely to find yourself in prison.
Okay, a bit of financial news. The Bank of England has released its latest credit conditions survey, and they're saying that lenders, banks, are going to impose what they describe as significant reductions on the availability of unsecured debt to UK households this year. It's also showing that banks have been reducing unsecured debt availability for the past 4 quarters, so the whole of 2017. That's after a significant increase in 2016. And this, they also say that there's been a sharp reported drop in demand for unsecured loans, with the exception of credit cards. So while Mark Carney over the recent months has been saying that there's too much consumer credit out there, too much debt held by consumers, and that banks have to reduce that, which they now seem to be doing. At the same time, in parallel with that, the demand for such loans has been reducing in the final quarter of 2017. And savings have also been reducing. So the so-called saving ratio fell to 5.2% in the third quarter of 2017, and this is the second lowest in 20 years. And they say that this stokes fears over the extent to which personal borrowing has been supporting GDP growth. And this, of course, is a point, Brian, that we've been making for quite some time, that GDP in this country hasn't been growing because of genuine growth in productive or even in the services economy. It's been growing because people have been spending money in just increasing amounts on credit cards and personal loans. And this is drawing to a close. So what is going to happen in Britain's economy over the next few years? I think we can predict that.
Trouble.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we've also got trouble in education, but this is an unusual one. Several people emailed in with this story, so we decided to cover it. The headline is "School Creates Playground Rich and Poor Zones, Separating Kids Whose Parents Didn't Pay £6 Donations for New Sports Equipment." This is Wednesbury Oak Academy in Tipton, West Midlands, was the school concerned. They've now got rid of this policy, but it was a pretty incredible story when you first got into it, that they wanted new play facilities. Before Christmas, they asked parents to pay £6. Some parents responded to that and some didn't. What then subsequently happened is, because not every parent had contributed, they stopped the children whose parents hadn't contributing from using that play area. So this was pretty nasty, pretty draconian. When you read into it a bit more, obviously there had been discussion in the school, so was it just the headmistress to blame? We know that many schools are under quite severe financial pressure. We also know that in schools, the management structure, as a result of policy from the Department of Education, is becoming more fractious, more pressurised. So it's difficult to tell exactly what happened here. But what seems to be the case from the parents' statement is that the school did separate those children. So you say, what kind of people, whether it was simply the head teacher or whether it was others, would take this problem out on very young children. I found that the key question. It's to do with morality. Why would you do this to small children? Well, bring in the local politician, and here he is, Adrian Bailey. He's quoted in some of the articles in the mainstream press. Schools should not be put in a position where they're forced to approach parents for contributions for equipment that would usually be paid for using the school's mainstream budget. So what does this guy do? He takes a moral question and he's out for cheap political gain out of it. This is Tory problems because there's apparently no money. So this article I found extremely interesting. It's a small story in some ways, but it's a very big story in other ways, because we're now into how we actually treat small children and how politicians are prepared to use even that subject for cheap political gain. It's another indicator of the state of the country at the moment, Mike, I think.
Next?
Well, this one probably takes us to the next one, which is white middle-aged men. So we're under a bit of pressure. This was a fascinating article from The Guardian. Who have we got on the left there? His name's just gone out of my head.
Brandon Lewis.
Brandon Lewis, thank you. On the left, Brandon Lewis, now running the Tory party, formerly policing minister. And let's not forget, this is the man who refused to take proper action over Met Police Officer John Wedger, talking about the abuse of children. So good man to have in your lineup there, I reckon.
Absolutely.
What's the story? Well, basically, the story is not a story. The headline is "Don't pity white middle-aged men. It's ludicrous to cast them as victims." And I've just taken one section about this, is that apparently the Mail was reporting about these white middle-aged men. And I certainly think some of these guys need to be removed. But apparently some ladies in France have stuck up for the white middle-aged men and say, well, if they want to come on to women, that's perfectly normal. Maybe that's a very French attitude, but that's the meat of the story. But then The Guardian goes on to say, well, we don't really need these all of these white middle-aged men there. There has been a slight adjustment in the figure. So at the end they say, that's all we're talking about. May's supposed purge of the white men has left a government that remains 68% male and 92.5% white. It's not a massacre. It's a teeny tiny baby step in the right direction. So this is a very confusing article in some ways. It's definitely getting at white middle-aged men. But what else is it doing? Well, there are some little clues here, because this gentleman is mentioned, Sundar Katwala of the British Future. He said those already at the top who find the gradual adjustments from 90 to 7% of leadership roles too dizzying should get challenged. So I was fascinated as to who this man really was, Sundar Katwala. I'd never heard of British Future. So the link from the paper puts you through to his Twitter page. So here he is there. He says the Mail headline is rather similar to the Tesco chairman John Allen feeling the pendulum had swung too far and that men were an endangered species in the boardroom once he was one of 9 men on a board of 12 alongside 3 women. So let's follow it through. Here's British Future. Don't worry, this is an independent organisation, Mike. The first video...
It's that use of independent, once again, isn't it?
Yes, it's independent, so you can trust it. The first embedded video I came across is busy talking about Brexit. This is BBC Radio 2 journalists speaking in that video at the bottom of the page there. And it's quite clear that this is not exactly a Leave video. This is talking about what Britain needs to do to present an acceptable immigration policy to the European Union. So I was fascinated with that. This is a bit more of their mainstream page, 2017, the British Future Year in Review, all very glossy. Decided to look at funding. And then it gets interesting because on the left here we've got the Barrow Cadbury Trust. Now, if anybody thinks this is just about sweets, you'll find that the Barrow Cadbury Trust is extremely big in putting its finger into society and saying they're going to tell us how society should be. We've got the Oak Foundation committing its resources to address issues of global science and
global social
and environmental concern, particularly those that have a major impact on the lives of the disadvantaged. So we're into global stuff here, Mike, which is good. Unbound Philanthropy, grant-making foundation dedicated to ensuring migrants. So it wasn't looking so independent to me at this stage, but when you get further down the list, it gets better, because here we've got George Soros's Open Society involved. So I think we know what's going on there. And down at the bottom, if you can see that other blue arrow, we've got the European Commission also putting in money. So I think that this is nothing to do with simply too many white middle-aged males. I think this is another massive attack on the structure of British society, and I think it's being done by the change agents, Soros and the European Commission.
Well, earlier on, Brian, you said, I wonder why the Guardian is promoting this in quite the subtle way that it is, but why is the Guardian doing it? And then we look at the people involved, and you've mentioned Sundar Kadwala there. Of course, he's the director of British Future, previously worked as a journalist, and he was a leader writer and internet editor on The Observer, which of course is the Guardian's Sunday newspaper. Steve Ballinger, the director of communications, well, he also worked for the Guardian, or for The Observer, sorry. Not quite. He worked for Amnesty International, and they ran a joint campaign with The Observer called irrepressible.info to protect online freedom of expression. So pretty keen Guardian links to this little organisation, whatever it is.
Which are not declared in the paper. In our chat room, a gentleman has said the director, Sundar Kadwala, was formerly General Secretary of the Fabian Society. So the picture builds. So this is not just an article about white men in positions of power. This is an article which is designed to attack the basis of society. And it's being done in a very devious way. We did phone Future Britain Future, to ask about the amount of funding, because they say if you ask, they're open and they will tell you. So I'm waiting for an email back with the exact amounts that Open Society and the European Commission have given this independent charity. We will see.
Chatham House has a new report out today, Cybersecurity of Nuclear Weapon Systems, Threats, Vulnerabilities and Consequences. And this is written by Beza Unal, a research fellow at Chatham House, who's previously worked on strategic analysis at NATO, and Patricia Lewis, who's also who's a research director of International Security Department of Chatham House. And so what are they saying? They're saying that nuclear weapon systems were first developed at a time when computer capabilities were in their infancy and little consideration was given to potential malicious cyber vulnerabilities. Many of the assumptions on which current nuclear strategies are based predate the current widespread use of digital technology in nuclear command, control and communication systems. There are a number of vulnerabilities and pathways through which a malicious actor may infiltrate a nuclear weapon system without a state's knowledge. Human errors, systems failures, design vulnerabilities and susceptibilities within the supply chain all represent common security issues in nuclear weapon systems. Cyber attack methods such as data manipulation, digital jamming and cyber spoofing could jeopardize the integrity of communication, leading to increased uncertainty in decision making. During peacetime, offensive cyber activities could create a dilemma for the state, as it may not know whether its systems have been subject to a cyber attack. This unknown could have implications for military decision making, particularly for decisions affecting nuclear weapons deterrence policies. At times of heightened tensions, cyber attacks on nuclear weapon systems could cause an escalation, which results in their use. Inadvertent nuclear launches could stem from unwitting reliance on false information and data. Moreover, a system that is compromised cannot be trusted in decision making. So I think that's a pretty spectacular thing for them to be suggesting, that a cyber attack could totally destroy the command and control structures with regard to nuclear weapons in Britain and the United States. But really the point that was in my mind, Brian, and we can have a conversation about this in a second, was that this is 2018 and they have produced this document. But surely this issue was addressed in the public domain in the mid-80s with the movie War Games. This was exactly this subject that was being raised by this film. So this isn't something new. This is something that's been absolutely understood for 30 years at least. So what on earth is Chatham House doing with this report? Is this just to stir up public concern about this issue, to raise money for cyber companies that are working in the cyberspace, the cybersecurity space, or is it just a general fear-mongering? Because it did get widespread mainstream media coverage this morning. Yeah. I'm not clear what exactly they're hoping to achieve with this particular paper, but if what they're saying is true, and bearing in mind the awareness that the public and the military should have had on this issue for 30 years, it would stagger me if this was a correct analysis.
I think we'd need to look at their report in detail, but there's something not right here, Mike, because the minimum you can say is that controls on nuclear weapons astonishingly rigorous, obviously, and you're talking about military-grade crypto before the keys can even be accessed. So are they saying that hackers are now in amongst military-grade crypto systems? If that's the case, and we've had to learn this from Chatham House or wherever it's come from, that is astonishing. Are they talking about building the picture that a nuclear weapon may be launched and therefore something happens? Well, that's the job of the military. So we're saying that the whole of the military is effectively in danger of being hacked. I want to see some evidence for this. I think this is fear factor, but I also think this is a sideways attack on Britain's nuclear deterrent, because what we're seeing with EU military unification, of course, is the power base of nuclear weapons going to the French. I'm very suspicious on this one. But not to worry, because we're getting a Royal Navy museum in Devonport, Plymouth. So we haven't got a fleet at the moment. We haven't actually got ships, really, in the vast 300-hectare naval base in Plymouth. But not to worry, because the mod has announced we are going to get money to build a museum to tell us that we did have a navy, but we don't have it anymore.
All those destroyers that are broken down at the moment, they could just be dragged over there by a tug and put straight into the museum.
Well, Mike, we could make a lot of fun about this. It would be very poor and very black humour, because this is such a dangerous situation where the Ministry of Defence regards a museum as more important than the fact that we have Type 45 destroyers that can't sail in water because it's too warm. Well, the Russians are taking things more seriously, and I beg your pardon, I've jumped ahead. We'll deal with this one first. This is the Germans taking things more seriously, because they are recruiting more miners than they've ever done before, and this has caused some consternation amongst the left-wing parties. So they're saying that 2,128 under-18s have been recruited as volunteers into the German military in 2017. That includes 448 young women. And this has been possible since 2011, where they started to recruit following the ending of conscription. But fascinating that the German army is now saying, well, we haven't got enough people. We're going to have to get in amongst the youngsters at school in order to get them into the army. And there's quite a backlash against this. So at the time we see the EU military unification taking place, and of course the German army is the army power in Europe, they are so desperate they're having to start to recruit youngsters. Meanwhile, Russia Today is mocking the British Army. This is their article, British Army in gay recruitment drive as soldier numbers fall. So they're not pulling any punches there with mocking the campaign that we talked about yesterday, which is saying that the British Army needs to become softer and more cuddly because it doesn't want to be the best. It's going to look after people. And if anybody's squeamish on this subject, where we're going on this one, I tweeted this out yesterday, encourage people to go and have a look at this particular YouTube. It's a mini documentary, it's 16 minutes long. It's talking about where the transgender agenda is going to take society. And I encourage people to go and look at this, and I say think about it from a totally neutral stance. Is this where we want to take our society? So do have a look at that one. And we'll bring in the Russians again here, because they've been doing a survey within Russia in which they're saying that a large number of Russians, over 60%, view the US as an immediate threat. Ukraine second. Well, that's understandable, I think, in view of the trouble they've had on their Russian western border. And then EU is also seen as one of the country's main enemies. So the headline I've put over that, I think, is absolutely correct. From end of the Cold War to an even colder war. It's fabulous, isn't it, Mike, how the European Union has been put forward as protecting us from war in Europe, but we now seem to be in a more and more dangerous position as a result of the European Union and its military structure.
Yeah.
We'll end there. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to the people who have sent in some donations already this early in 2018. We are very keen for more subscribers. We're very keen for more donations, because we would like to expand the news that we're providing, and we'll be telling you more about this in the coming weeks. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.